Welcome back. For those joining us from other time zones, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This next session speaks to an extremely important topic, our global path to recovery from this pandemic, especially as we look to governments, corporations, and leaders to provide crucial pathways forward. I am excited to present our next session, Greening Recovery and Green New Deals, bringing COVID recovery plans and stimulus packages, and advancing inclusive Green New Deals. Please enjoy.
Excellencies, global citizens of all ages, all of you who have joined us for this session, I am so pleased to be your moderator today. I am the president of the Club of Rome, and really having watched today's sessions, we've been through a very thought-provoking day. A day of solidarity and gratitude for the planet we call home and the life-sustaining function of the nature and ecosystems we have around us. And today we actually, this morning, had the signing of the Leaders' Pledge and a launch which actually brought together 70 nations representing 1.5 billion people and 30% of global GDP. This Leaders' Pledge for Nature also declares that we are in a planetary emergency. But what we want from this session on the recovery is to look at what emerging from emergency look like, to go through and work and understand those countries that have put in place new economic systems through well-being indicators or shifting towards what we call donut economics. Those countries and also cities that are looking at a green and social recovery as the way in building greater resilience in their economies. So I am very pleased as we move into this session, as the president of the Club of Rome, having already for 50 years, the club declaring that we need to move from growth dynamics into an economy which values people. This is the way in which we will be able to emerge from the convergence of the three tipping points of climate, biodiversity, and the health pandemic. It's therefore my honor to be able to lead you through this session and to bring in Mr. Jose Angel Gurria Trevino, the Secretary General of the OECD, followed by the European Commissioner for the Economy, Paolo Gentiloni, for their reflections. This will be followed by a short video address with former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. I hope that you will very much stay with us for this exciting session as we invite many ministers and experts to discuss this important global problématique. How do we get out of COVID through a green and social recovery?
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to address this session on the green recovery and Green New Deals. COVID-19 is closely linked to an unprecedented biodiversity loss. We have altered 3/4 of the world's terrestrial surface and 2/3 of the marine environment. Ecosystem destruction and wildlife exploitation are key drivers of zoonotic diseases in humans. And around $44 trillion of global value added depends on nature today. Now, safeguarding biodiversity can help us build more resilient societies, reduce future health risks. Let me highlight 3 priorities. First, we must mainstream biodiversity into the recovery. And this we should do through the screening of the policies before they're actually applied and the monitoring of the policies after they have been applied. So screening ex ante and monitoring ex post, the biodiversity impact of the stimulus measures. The OECD is contributing through its 13 environmental indicators, ranging from carbon intensity, renewables in the energy mix, effective carbon rates, water stress, etc. Second, we must align policies and scale up positive incentives. OECD analysis shows that government support potentially harmful to biodiversity amounts to $500 billion, billion with a B. That is every year. And it's 5 times more than the spending that is allocated to protect biodiversity. So we're saying we are protecting biodiversity. We're spending 80 to 85 billion per year to protect biodiversity, and at the same time spending 5 or 6 times more than that, with public policies in order to undo precisely what we're doing with the one hand, we're undoing with the other. Third, governments must harness the potential of businesses and the financial sector by mobilizing private finance. Our green finance and responsible business conduct work supports countries to promote private sector efforts to measure and account for biodiversity-related risks and impacts. Now, we at the OECD have been supporting governments tackle the crisis on various fronts. We launched a digital hub on tackling the coronavirus. We now have produced 144 policy briefs on everything that we do and the COVID. We've provided policy advice to global fora, such as the G20. We've organized 3 virtual ministerial council roundtables, one on growth, one on jobs, and the third one in the environment. And the most recent one on the environment is the Ministerial Council Roundtable on Green Recovery. Environment ministers underlined that investing in an ecosystem restoration, on reforestation, and fighting invasive species creates new jobs, creates stimulus, creates longer-term resilience. Ecosystem restoration, just in the US, for example, provides direct employment for 126,000 workers and generates about $9.5 billion in economic output per year. It also creates a further 95,000 indirect jobs and about 15 billion in household spending. Last but not least, the 2020 OECD Business and Finance Outlook, which we are launching tomorrow, actually, explores how to better align investments with long-term value through more consistent, comparable, verifiable data on environmental, social, and governance performance. So, ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic is a stark reminder of the transformational changes needed to build back better. So let's use this opportunity to build greener, more resilient, more inclusive economies. Remember, the single most important intergenerational responsibility that we have today is to protect the planet for the future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. I'd like to now pass the floor to the Commissioner, because obviously the EU and the President's State of the Union address has very much been looking at how the recovery and a Green New Deal will bring Europe out of this pandemic and prepare for the future climate neutrality and the preservation of biodiversity. Commissioner, please.
Thank you very much, Sandrine. Thank you for the opportunity to address the Nature for Life event. I would like to pass a message of optimism despite the difficult times we are all going through. In Europe, we are convinced that we can turn this crisis, which has hit our citizens and our economies so hard, into an opportunity. Our recovery strategies will put the green transition at the center for a more sustainable and inclusive growth. Before the COVID-19 outbreak, as you know, the European Commission presented its plan for the European Green Deal, at the time proposing to unlock 1 trillion of sustainable investments over the next decade. The pandemic didn't stop this purpose, but reinforced our determination to move forward. Our goal is to achieve the carbon neutrality in 2050, and recently we increased our target for 2030, that is to reduce our emission at least by 55%. At the heart of this next generation EU recovery package is a facility worth 660 billion, and the Commission will ensure that the green transition is high on the agenda of national plans using this facility. We will ask that each national plan include a minimum of 37% target of expenditure related to climate and green flagship programs. We also committed to finance a large part of this recovery plan via the issuance of green bonds, with a target of 30% of our total issuance in mind. This would make the EU one of the largest issuers of green bonds worldwide. At the same time, we are working to green our economic governance tool. Climate action will be implemented in the EU long-term budget. A target of 30% of this 7-year budget has been set for climate-related spending. And we are also integrating the UN SDG in our cycle of economic and fiscal policy coordination, with a scoreboard of member state situation in relation to SDG. Last, we are encouraging member states to implement green budgeting practices in their national budgets. Green taxation has also a vital role to play in the EU recovery from the pandemic, because well-designed environmental taxes can send the right price signals and provide the incentives for more sustainable behaviors. Next year, the Commission will put forward a proposal to bring the EU Energy Taxation Directive in line with our recovery goals and climate ambitions, and also we will put forward a proposal for a carbon border adjustment mechanism to ensure that the price of imports of carbon reflects more accurately the content of carbon. The green transition will not work if our citizens are left behind, and this is why we have also established a just transition mechanism to support our most affected citizens and regions with a package worth at least 100 billion euros. At the same time, our Green Deal will create new opportunities for jobs all over the continent. In conclusion, we will use all the tools at our disposal to move the climate agenda forward. The green transition is our chance to live, produce, and consume differently. We need to learn to work with and not against nature, as Angel Gurria just said. Nature enables our economies, human civilization, and life itself to prosper. We have tended to take this for granted. We can't take it for granted no more.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. And thank you as well, Secretary General. I have a quick question for both of you. You both are working also with many other countries. Yourself, Commissioner, with member states as members of the European Union, and yourself, Secretary General, with the OECD countries. What can we do to scale up the commitments of the recovery plans towards green and social implications? We know now through a Bloomberg report that only 20% of the funds globally that have gone into recovery have really gone to green programs with some social implications. Would either one of you like to answer this question?
Well,
Please,
if
Commissioner.
I may, Angel, my answer in a European perspective is that I think what we are deciding in the implementation of this next generation recovery plan is very important. It will not be easy, but when I was mentioning the fact that we are indicating a target of 37% of this recovery package that is mandatory to commit to investment in the green transition, I think we are doing something very important.
Agreed.
I know that this is not easy. It will be a regulation, so it will be legally binding. It's not something that we are suggesting. We will approve these plans, provided that they dedicate 37% of the investment to green transition connected investment. Of course, we will have to face some risk.
Only because of our limited amount of time, I apologize. But yes. Secretary General, and you're right, Commissioner, most of the green recovery funding that has been green has been in a European context. So Secretary General, how can we get the rest of the world on board to really look at the green recovery as a way out of COVID?
We have to get public policies to stop damaging nature, to stop damaging the environment, to undo the harmful policies, to stop subsidizing fossil fuels, to, as I mentioned in my remarks, to stop, supporting the harmful practices on biodiversity, while at the same time we try to support biodiversity itself. We have to put a big fat price on emissions. We have to have a big fat price on a tax or whatever you want to call it, a price that will change people's conducts, because basically we are contradicting ourselves. We are fighting against this very great problem, which is climate change and the biodiversity and the oceans, etc. And at the same time, we are supporting the policies that do the most harm. So the governments themselves, by simply being consistent, by being convergent, by taking a hard look at themselves, they can do a lot of good.
Thank you very much, Secretary General and Commissioner. I will now pass to the video of Ban Ki-moon, former Secretary General of the UN, who will give us his thoughts about a green recovery and Green New Deals. Yes, we seem to be having a problem with the video. Apologies, ladies and gentlemen. Let us move on then to the next exciting panel. This is going to be a leaders' dialogue on innovation and inclusivity. And clearly, we are in a planetary emergency, and we have, most of us, realize that this is the greatest existential threat to humanity. So we need to have green and social recovery, which is both innovative and also inclusive. We have to bring people on board. This is about putting nature at the core with people at the core. And so if we look at how we can actually create truly inclusive transformational shifts, this is the moment to tap into human consciousness. This is the way in which we can see what truly is essential. As the Club of Rome indicated already 50 years ago, we have to move away from just a growth scenario into bringing values back into our economics. Through COVID, people have realized what is truly essential in their lives. Healthy people, healthy planet, and this has actually brought forward incredible stories of transformational change within communities, business leadership, and novel new governance systems. So I'd like to bring in our next speakers who will really enable us to see how their recovery plans have enabled them to come out more resilient through COVID. I'd like to start with Minister Mikkonen of Finland, who, as also one of the well-being economies, is demonstrating the importance of well-being economics. Dr. Mohammed Abukar Mahmoud, Minister of the Environment, Federal Republic of Nigeria. Mr. Oliver Greenfield, conveyor of the Green Economy Coalition. And we will have a pre-recorded video message from the Minister of Environment and Climate Change from Scotland. So I will start with you, Minister. If you could say a few words of how you see this green recovery and the Green Deal and your own resilience plans towards recovery.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for organizing this very topical event. I'm honored to share our views and experiences on green recovery plans for the global north, Finland. COVID-19 crisis hit my country in the middle of the implementing our very ambitious government program. This program sets the target to become the world's first carbon neutral welfare state by 2035. Building our future wealth on circular economy and stopping the biodiversity loss. Not a small task, even without the public health and economic crisis that COVID-19 caused globally last spring. I have no doubt that this crisis is also a once in the humankind opportunity to bring our economies within the planetary boundaries. Whether it's a question of €1 or $1 or 1 billion, it can be used only once. And we must make sure we use public resources wisely, solving as many crises as we can at the same time. Business as usual is indeed no longer an option. The case for green recovery has clearly been made. That's why I focus in my remarks more on the how than the why. Our government saw it essential to make economical recovery to work for, not against, our ambitious environmental targets. We were extremely pleased to see that we were not alone, that the other European Union member states, other nations, the European Commission, and international organizations were doing the same. And these are my two first key messages. Number one, governments and organizations need to take action swiftly in the changing circumstances. Number two, we are stronger in green recovery by doing it together, globally, with the support of the international organizations. In Finland, as a Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, I appointed an advisory group for sustainable recovery to find measures that will create significant economic stimulus and jobs and work for climate and nature. This advisory group is now finalizing its work and has already come forward with recommendations for measures and also set a criteria on how to assess the proposals. All in all, the Finnish government has already implemented some 1.5 billion euros worth of measures this year which fulfill the criteria of sustainable recovery, such as replacing oil heating in housing and municipal buildings, subsidies for renewable energy, building rail infrastructure, investing in electric vehicle charging stations. Last week, the government decided on the main outlines of our sustainable growth plan, our national plan to use the EU Recovery and Resilience Facility, the RRF. What was very important is that the government decided that about half of the funding will be dedicated to the green transition objective. The work on concrete plans is underway and the government is consulting cities, municipalities and regional authorities as well as stakeholders in the coming weeks. My third and last message is hence the most important. All the funding for green recovery reforms and investments must respect do no harm principle, which is the key for both of the Convention of Biological Diversity and the Paris Agreement climate objectives. Putting this principle in practice is now our challenging task, where we also need the global efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And may I turn now to you. From the perspective of Nigeria, Dr. Mohammed Abubakar Mahmoud, can you give us some indications of what you have done to recover from COVID and how you've looked at green and social implications as you've done so?
Thank you, Excellencies. With the COVID outbreak this last year, up to this year, the link between health, biodiversity, climate change, and economy became obvious, and we quickly realized the need to strengthen collaborations and coordination in these linked spheres alongside the scaling up of domestic, regional, and international financing support for green recovery. One of the obvious impacts of COVID-19 pandemic has been the exposure of national economic vulnerabilities. In order to avoid drastic decline in economic growth, Nigeria announced a stimulus package as part of the post-COVID-19 economic sustainability plan. A number of key projects have been included in the plan. One of these key projects is the proposed installation of solar power homes for up to 5 million homes. Alongside its socio-economic impact, this particular activity will drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions from this sector and enhance resilience. For the implementation of this project, the Federal Ministry of Environment will interface with implementing agencies to ensure the adoption of a climate-smart, environment-friendly approaches so as not to cause further damage to the environment and enable green recovery. In being proactive towards green recovery, a strategic position document called Post-COVID-19 Medium-Term Strategy and Plan 2020 for the environment sector was developed. The document diagnosed potential future environmental challenges for Nigeria in the post-COVID-19 period. It provided the strategic activities and initiatives that will be implemented in the medium term, as well as provided an implementation framework to tackle these challenges. The activities are to properly monitored and evaluated for impact in promoting sustainable development in the country's environment sector. 10 top strategic issues were identified for implementation, which will enable the required linkages and coherent towards green recovery. This include 1, chemicals and waste, climate change, disaster risk reduction and management, ecosystem management, environmental governance, environmental health and biodiversity, erosion control and flood management, resource efficiency and green development, strategic environmental assessment, and sustainable land management. To ensure sustainable recovery and resilience, the ministry is working to align policy targets, time frames, financing mechanisms, and perhaps institutional structures that will support low carbon resilient development agendas, such as the Sustainable Development Goals.
Wonderful.
The
Thank
Paris
you, Your
Agreement.
Excellency. I'm going to have to ask you to finish. Thank you
Okay,
so much,
thank
Your
you very
Excellency.
much.
We'll get a chance to bring you back in. We'll just have a few questions. I wanted to turn to Oliver
Okay.
Greenfield from the Green Economy Coalition. Your Excellency, you have listed quite a few different shifts and indicators within your economy as you're moving into the green recovery. And Oliver, I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of your impression of really what we are seeing. Is this just a niche movement of green economy shifts, or are we really starting to see post-COVID a real shift towards Green New Deals and green recovery?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sabrine. Well, Sabrine, you talked about COVID crises, extinction crises, climate crises. I'd like to say that COVID has exposed another one, which is inequality crisis.
Yeah.
And I think that for us to see the sort of transition and speed that you are talking about, we must address that crisis alongside. And so I'd like to make 3 points, and they are that inclusion matters, citizens' dialogues, and something you may not have heard, or some of you are listeners may not have heard of, social contract. Okay, so first point is we don't think that bureaucratic policy or technology solutions will save the day. People need to be at the core of this. Societies must drive and demand the change from their governments, their businesses. And for that to happen, inclusion matters. First point, inclusion matters. And by that, I mean structured participatory processes that give all people a seat at the decision-making table, giving them a stake in the decisions, in their implementation, and ultimately their outcomes. And if you don't think about inclusion or you don't address inclusion, let's remember the yellow vests. You know, inclusion makes transition happen. Inclusion makes transition faster and better. Second point, citizens' dialogues, is how to do inclusion. At a micro level, we're talking about helping people dialogues, helping people organize around local issues. So what matters in Delhi may be different to what happens in Ulaanbaatar or in London or Paris. Find the issues that motivate people, give them an opportunity to express that issue into green recovery debates. At a national level, we see the value and importance of growing recognition of citizens' assemblies, challenging national thinking. The GEC calls on governments around the world to really look at citizens' recovery assemblies to ensure the voice and implementation partners of society. And third point, how to scale up. How to scale up. I mean, okay, we are seeing strong leadership, but just at the moment when we need strong leadership, we also recognize there is trust in policymakers is at an all-time low. But we have a common enemy. The COVID is a common enemy. And I would say there is a phenomenon, a positive phenomenon, a glimmer of a new potential, a global solidarity amongst ordinary people. They want to be safer. They want their economies to be resilient and greener. But to capture this ephemeral zeitgeist requires a mechanism, a process to embody it. And so I bring your attention to the frame social contract. Could social contract be a way to reinvigorate democracy and trust in leaders by creating a new articulated commitment and an inclusive process to deliver the transition? A commitment that the transition will be fair, no one will be left behind, the youth will have their jobs, the green jobs, a commitment to dismantle the historic inequalities of race, gender, and ignoring the rights of our young people. A commitment to a process where all voices will be equal and all will be heard. GEC thinks social contract could be this potential to take this to scale, how to take this transition to scale by getting that societal ownership and buy-in. But let us be clear, if it is to offer that potential, it cannot just be run by business or by governments. It needs to be driven by civil society groups, by union groups, and by the people themselves, and that process is put in place.
Thank you so much, Oliver, and could not agree more. I mean, clearly we have to have a social contract. We need to bring people on the journey, and we need to also tap into that consciousness that I was talking about, where people are realizing that they want to go back to business, not business as usual, but new essentials and what's important to them. And citizen assemblies are fundamental with that. Before we go into a bit of a discussion, I would like to play the video. We have a couple of questions for you. But first, I'd like to play the pre-recorded video from Rosianna Cunningham, who's the Cabinet Secretary for the Environment and Climate for Scotland.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to speak on green recovery. When it comes to the twin challenge of tackling climate change and biodiversity loss, Scotland is extremely ambitious. Last year, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon was among the world leaders to declare a climate emergency. We have since legislated to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030 and to be net zero by 2045. Scotland is also unique in having underpinned our emissions targets with a legal obligation to a just transition, meaning that we will all share in the benefits of decarbonisation and leave no one behind. We were also the first country to submit a full progress report against the international biodiversity targets agreed at Aichi, Japan in 2010. Last year, we set out a Green New Deal to rethink the investments we make and how we make them in order to deliver that just transition to net zero by 2045. In light of COVID, we adapted this commitment to form the basis of our green recovery, an approach which is fundamentally important to the future prosperity of our people and our planet. When the kaleidoscope of our lives is shaken, we have the chance to put things back together differently. Scotland is accelerating investments in green jobs and skills, focusing on actions that deliver the most co-benefits to our people and economy. Accordingly, we recently announced groundbreaking funding to support the decarbonisation of Scotland's homes and buildings. The Scottish Government was delighted to lead in shaping the new global biodiversity framework through negotiating the Edinburgh Declaration. We would be very grateful if you would consider adding your support to this declaration. Healthy biodiversity underpins all of the benefits that nature provides for us. Wherever possible, we are utilising nature-based solutions to the problems of climate and ecological change. Scotland is blessed with ample scope for tree planting and peatland restoration, both of which, through long-term investment from the Scottish Government, are helping to tackle climate change.
Essential if we're really going to emerge from emergency. We have to talk about people, planet, and prosperity together. How do you feel, Minister, in Finland, that you've been able to integrate this through your well-being indicators?
It's very important that we take everybody involved. And I'm happy to notice that it's not only the government, but we need the cities, we need the municipalities, and we need the business world. And I can see that especially the cities and municipalities have been very active. And for example, most of the cities in Finland have even the more ambitious climate target than our national one. And now when it's a time for the recovery, the cities and municipalities also play a very important role, and we need to make sure that they are all involved.
Thank you for that, and I'm pleased that Your Excellency, you're actually back. I think you're back. I saw that you were back in the panel. I wanted to ask you a specific question with regard to. So this goes to our minister from Nigeria. Sorry, we're having a bit of a tricky back and forth here in terms of the video coverage. There we are. Okay, there you are. Wonderful to have you back with us. there's a question here that's coming from the outside, asking about Indigenous people in local communities. And we know very much how important this is as a heritage also within Africa. How in Nigeria are you taking into consideration in your recovery plans local communities and also the stewards of the land, which is some of the Indigenous people and tribes?
We have been engaging a lot of the indigenous, especially when it comes to the climate change issue. We just recently introduced a gender action plan and climate change to the Federal Executive Council, which was approved, and this also, along with the stimulus package from the government, engaging women and youth, especially women, will realize with the issue of climate change, women are more vulnerable. And so what we do this time around is to actually engage the indigenous people wherever they are, either in afforestation, reforestation, agroforestry, and also anything to do with substitute for using firewood. Instead of firewood, we're providing them with certain smart stoves that will burn briquettes, which will take maybe just 1 or 2, that will do cooking for a whole meal for the family instead of burning tons and tons of firewood. So we are engaging the indigenous people to own any kind of project that the government is putting out there.
Thank you so much. And it's clear that clean cooking stoves in Africa is absolutely fundamental at the community level, and also bringing in women leaders and women into the problem solving at the community level. Now, we've also had a question with regard to cities, and Oliver, I don't know if you want to just have a quick reflection. When we're looking at the local level and citizen assemblies, as you indicate, how can we ensure that we do this quite quickly, in particular in a pandemic? I mean, we've spoken obviously to the Fridays for the Future movement, and they're having difficulties in moving into the streets as they did before, even though they just recently had another demonstration. So how are you seeing local authorities actually really bringing people in at this time?
I think when we look at cities, one of the really interesting things that has shown in this pandemic is the vulnerability people feel, particularly for food. There are concerns about food supply chains and our resilience. How resilient are our cities? And I think for the very first time, an awful lot of people that may have lived in very stable societies before felt really, really vulnerable. And we've even had food crises here in the UK where people empty the shelves within a couple of weeks. This is an extraordinary moment where we have to really capture the idea of resilient cities. And what does resilience mean? It means access to food, access to water, access to energy. And if you have teenage sons, access to internet. We really absolutely need to see that centrally. And that is voiced in itself anyway. That's voiced in itself by the behaviors of people, by the concerns of people. So as we build back better, I would like to see national risk registers really identify where we are on risk, where we are on resilience, and put that out for discussion and negotiation. Are we spending enough on resilience? Are we spending enough making sure we are resilient? And that has become a priority from people. So whilst a lot of people aren't necessarily able to go to the streets to argue, they are online and they are voicing their increased vulnerabilities and concerns around where we are moving and how we recover back. And resilience, as you put right up front, needs to be central to that recovery, because people are insecure from this and they're feeling that vulnerability more than ever before.
Thank you for bringing up the importance of risk resilience. And in fact, last week at the European Union, there was the Research and Innovation Days. And one of the calls of the new group think tank for the European Commission that I'm lucky enough to chair has been recommending that we put in place proper risk management plans for this planetary emergency in order to prepare for future crises. And so a risk register is absolutely fundamental. We know that the business community, we know that the investment community, and we know that countries have actually emergency plans. So why are we not declaring emergency plans linked to the planetary emergency? This is absolutely ridiculous. And this is a perfect inroads to our next panel as we move into finance and investment, and actually how we plan the shift within our economic system and the underbelly of finance to really change the direction of our investments. So I'd like to thank you all very much for joining me on this session, and now move into the next session. So as we were saying, finance and investing is really absolutely fundamental as we move forward. And protecting nature is about protecting our economy. As said earlier by the Prime Minister Solberg of Norway, in fact, we know that if we do not properly cost capital of nature, and if we do not necessarily put a price on nature and nature's services, as also Achim Steiner told us today, then we will continue to destroy nature at the level and the speed that we have done so, and which has gotten us really into this convergence of crises. This is why we need to place nature and carbon neutral products and services on our balance sheets. It's why we need to look at debt for nature swaps and also debt in general, because as we have this economic downturn, we need to be in solidarity with those countries that are the most vulnerable. We know that private financial capital is there, and we know that there's growing interest in private environmental, social, and governance investment post-COVID. In fact, in a recent Financial Times poll, 9 out of 10 wealth managers believe that the pandemic would result in an increase in environmental, social, and governance investments due to better risk adjustment performance across sustainability products and value chains globally. Pension funds are pulling out of fossil energy and stranded assets. Countries that are supporting the destruction of tropical forests are also getting money taken away from their aid programs as well as from pension funds. However, green bonds are on the rise, but they're still niche, 2% of the bond market. And we do not yet fully apply taxonomy and do no significant harm requirements to our investments across the investment community. So this is fundamental in embedding in recovery package and green deals. I'd like to bring in my next panel to discuss finance and investment and start with a very strong message from CEOs who are firmly behind the need for a green recovery and a Green New Deal.
The science is clear. Nature is everyone's business, and the next 10 years are critical.
We must reverse nature loss before we reach a tipping point from which ecosystems will not recover.
We're proud of applying our science to drive innovation that helps reverse nature loss.
How we can work together as a human community to respond fast, better.
By recovering waste as a source of energy and a source for raw materials, we are preserving Earth's resources and shaping cleaner cities.
Cost of inaction is too high when it comes to nature loss.
We believe that we nourish people by nature with very healthy dairy products, but we can only do that if we nourish the planet.
We measure the impact on biodiversity at portfolio level and strive for a net positive gain in 2030.
We need governments and policymakers to also be transformative and create new laws and frameworks, and of course in collaboration then with businesses that needs to step up with their actions and their commitments.
Only by working together with governments, communities and societies will we be able to create a healthy planet for everyone.
We need to develop and implement frameworks that integrate the value of nature in decision-making and global market mechanisms.
Policies that make the best available technologies mainstream, transparently measure their impacts, and integrate sustainability into the education system.
I welcome rules regulation which encourage circular economy and climate and incentivize companies to have a positive impact on biodiversity.
We owe it to our stakeholders and to the next generation of stakeholders to protect nature.
Our collective future depends on global communities coming together to ensure a greener and more inclusive tomorrow.
Nice to see 560 companies from across the globe who have put nature at the core of their business model and actually are putting a price on nature. So how do we translate this movement within the business community into also a movement where our balance sheets are reflecting the cost and the price of nature? How do we look at drawing the dots between government finance programs and stimulus packages which finance the new business as usual, the companies that are putting nature at the core, that are putting decarbonization at the core, that understand that we're in the midst of a planetary emergency? My next panel is going to be with some very distinguished speakers across government and also across expert communities who understand how to do this in practice. So I'd like to ask first Ms. Andrea Meza, Her Excellency, who is representing as Minister of Environment and Energy the Republic of Costa Rica and is also one of the core leads, along with the European Union, of the High Ambition Coalition for Biodiversity and also for Climate. His Excellency, Mr. Simon Steele, Minister for Climate and Resilience, Environment, Forestry, and Fisheries and Disaster Management from Grenada. Welcome. Ms. Anuela Ristani, Deputy Mayor, City of Ticana in Albania. And Mr. Simon Zadek, Chair of Financing for Biodiversity. So may I start with you, Mrs. Meza, as Minister of Costa Rica, and also Costa Rica has really shown so much leadership in putting nature at the core of its economy and also at the core of its thinking for the next steps in the future recovery. Can you give us a bit of your feeling from an investment and finance perspective? What is needed in order to truly shift into a green economy and a green recovery?
Thank you, Sandrine, and it's a pleasure. I'm so delighted I've been sharing this panel with all these distinguished friends and colleagues. And I will say that it's very critical to have coherence in our policies. This is one element which gives clear signals to the private sector, which give clear messages to the different stakeholders. This element of whole of a government approach and whole of society approach is critical. Once we have clear policies, I think that we as government, we also need to develop instruments, specific instruments that allows the private sector to engage in this transformation of our economies. And also one element is to analyze incentives and subsidies and really eliminate those subsidies that are contributing to the destruction of nature, and of course give incentives to those activities that contributes to the protection of nature. I think that it is so clear, this interrelationship of the biodiversity loss and the climate crisis, and now with the pandemic as well. And one element that we are doing right now is working with the Minister of Planning and working with the Ministry of Finance to also put activities that are critical to protect nature in our recovery plans. We will be mobilizing big amounts of money, and we need to have this coherence in part of our interventions as governments. And then again, the other critical element, and it's part also of the work we're doing here, is to bring the financial sector and really green the financial sector. And there is appetite for this. Here in Costa Rica, we have been working with the financial sector. They already signed a green protocol. And now we are in the phase of identifying a specific financial products that we can deliver in order for the private sector to engage and collaborate in this transformation.
Much, Minister, and I think your point on the whole of government approach and whole of society approach is very much what is needed to cover the people, planet, and prosperity angle. And what we find so interesting is this is now actually crossing the political spectrum. We just had in the State of the Union address by the President of the European Commission, who's a representative of the Conservative Party, who made exactly the same statement as yourself. So it's interesting to see that actually this is now becoming mainstream in those governments who understand what it needs to move forward and build resilience. And I want to turn to you actually, Mr. Steele, and coming at it from obviously an island state, what is your feeling in terms of how has it been to be able to shift to a green recovery? Has it been easy? Have you been able to communicate with people and really bring in the investment and the finance measures that you need to start to move out of the economic downturn? Or are you still in the midst?
Well, we're still in the midst of it. So thank you, Sandrine. What I want to do is just share some observations. I was in a session last week with the Green Climate Fund, looking at green stimulus packages, looking at ways in which we can turn all of the challenges and this crisis that we face into an opportunity to reshape growth, accelerating the transition to green and sustainable pathways, and looking at whether this is a real opportunity or are we taking advantage of this opportunity to further our agenda on nature-based solutions. And the question, Yannick Glemrick asked the question, are we at a global tipping point or are we at a turning point? And before we got into answering that question, we looked at the inadequacies that currently exist with global financing inflows for resilience building. And also the fact that the call for additional resources to fight COVID, how that has compounded the challenges that we face. And again, we looked at this brutal reality that we're facing with the pandemic, how that has stripped bare our vulnerabilities, especially as small island developing states, whether it's from a social perspective, health perspective, whether it's economically, and we're facing the economic pandemic as we speak. And then our physical vulnerabilities as we are here at the height of hurricane season and all of the challenges, day-to-day challenges that we face with many of the impacts, slow onset impacts of climate change. And we were all in agreement that there is this unique opportunity that exists right now, and an opportunity that we should not squander. There was also the observation that that all of the development agencies are all aligned in their thinking right now. We talk about green recovery, blue recovery, building back better, building forward. All of the right words are there, the thoughts are coming together, but the question is, will we? Will we do those things that we are outlining in these strategies? And when we look at the trillions of dollars that have already been invested globally in stimulus packages, the analysis tells us that half of those investments have been in non-low carbon programs, So when we drew our conclusion, are we at a tipping point? Are we at a turning point? The conclusion that we drew is that we're still at, that the jury is still out. So how, the challenge for us is how do we translate those words into action? We're seeing leadership from in terms of a lot of the institutional leadership. We're seeing leadership at country levels. But I think the conclusion that's been drawn is that we still have a long way to go.
Thank you very much. And that is a bit of a sobering perspective, which you are absolutely right. I mean, I had heard statistics that only actually 20% of our programs were going into green recovery. You're indicating that potentially 50. Who knows? The jury is out. And the jury is out, as you say, around how do we shift from a tipping point to a turning point. And I think that part of that shift very much happens at the local level. In fact, a panel that I was leading not long ago, we talked about trickle up rather than trickle down. Trickle up because we're seeing the resilience within the fiber of cities and also people programs, citizens, which are really coming together in communities rather than only the trickle down. It'd be interesting to get your perspective, Ms. Vistani, in terms of being in charge as deputy mayor of a city in Albania, which is also a city in Central and Eastern Europe, what your thinking is at this time, which as Mr. Steele has indicated, is a very difficult time for economies in transition.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me here. It's so right what you're saying. It's a turning point, and for us here in Tirana, you'd see it's not just a turning point because of the pandemic, but we were aware at a moment in time when we were thinking to rebuild after some devastating earthquakes we had last year. The first one in September, and then in November of 2019. And right at the moment we were trying to rethink and rebuild and reconceive our city in a greener way, the pandemic happened and then everything that followed. But I wanted to share with you 3 main points. And on the local level, just like you said, the first thing we learned is to make sure we do things that cannot be undone. So it's really easy to take action and make minor adjustments, whether they are on the economic perspective or whether they are on the local perspective with the green economy and the green city focus. But then if they can be easily undone, then chances are they're not sustainable and they're not there to make a large impact. We've started with a Green City Action Plan in 2016 with the support of EBRD, and now we're following up, and I'm happy to learn this is, what has been in the topic of international financing these days. We are now stepping into the next stage of really giving a price tag to nature-based investments on the local level. Cities are some of the main clients of banks or investment opportunities, and being bankable and being solvable means that you need to invest in programs. But in order to invest in programs that are green, you really need to make a lot of cases in terms of how you what your return is in nature-based investment. We very funnily make very, very good cases when we want to build roads and we want to build infrastructure or new buildings, but very rarely do we make a case on building a proper forest, like our orbital forest here in Tirana, in which we've committed to plant 2 million trees by 2030. So that's the first thing. Make sure that it's not undoable later on. The second thing I wanted to share with you, and like you very fairly said, is to make sure that all of your actions are all inclusive. Make sure that all citizens are involved. Whether we want to plant trees and we involve seniors or young couples getting married, or whether it is teaching our kids from 3-year-olds to learn how to bike and make sure that they are using the bike lanes that we're providing for them. You need to get them involved. There's very little institutions or governments alone can do unless we change everyone's attitudes and we have everybody be part of this. And the third thing, which I think it's something that we need to learn because of the need, not so much because it's the best way to go, is we have a thing in here in the city, and it's called tri-storming. The minister said before, we want to make sure that we have those strategies followed up on. And I believe that most of the time we waste too much time with strategies, and then very little is tried out of those things that we discuss in panels and in roundtables full of energy and full of thought. Because we are a city in a country that is going through economic transition, then is not quite there in terms of really having a solid and bankable economy, we didn't have much time to waste. So instead of going on with endless strategies and research, we just said, you know, what can be worse at this point? So we try projects that do not have negative implications, that might not be as thought of or as tested through historically, but there are marginal changes that can make the difference. So instead of, you know, wasting endless times of doing strategy, how about trying projects? How about trying things that have worked somewhere else and for our city as well? Some of our bike lanes are actually things that we found a city with 0 bike lanes, and now we have 47 kilometers and counting. We found a city where 0 trees were planted each year, and now we have 300,000 of them every year. So some of these things is just taking action now.
Thank you so much, Deputy Mayor. And I think you also bring up some of the interesting aspects, again, of the crisis. I mean, when you look at mobility and the way in which our urban centers are transforming before our eyes, we also have to think that this is the moment to be transformative within our urban centers and to tap into the opportunities of transformation. But as very clearly indicated by Andrea Mesa, it is also clear that we're putting perverse subsidies on all the things that we actually want to shift away from, fossil energy rather than renewables. We know renewables are now comparable in price to fossil energy. There is no reason why we should not be investing in a green recovery. And yet we don't see that real turning point. So I now want to turn to you, Simon, because one has been indicated is that there's also now a collaboration between cities at the local level, governments, and also multilateral development banks in really trying to enable the transformation. You've been in the institutions for many years, and now you're looking at financing for biodiversity. You and I have had, I don't know how many conversations around debt for nature, and you really understand what needs to be done to start to shift the transformation. Because one thing we haven't talked about is the need to really preserve the nature that we have. I often say building back better to a certain degree is a fantasy, because we will not build back our glaciers. We will not get back those tropical forests that we've actually cut for hundreds and thousands of years. So what do we do now in terms of ensuring that we preserve the nature that we have?
Thanks very much, Sandrine. So I think my colleague presenters have really identified the 2 critical areas that I wanted to focus on. Yeah, as we emerge from the crisis and think about recovery, there are essentially 2 multi-trillion-dollar financial flows we need to focus on. One is the stimulus, and second is the sovereign debt crisis. The stimulus, as the minister from Grenada has already said, today amounting to over 12 trillion US dollars, is largely unaligned with green and nature-related outcomes. Financing for Biodiversity has produced a stimulus index covering a number of different countries, including all of the G20 countries. And what we have found is that 16 out of the 20 stimulus programs across the G20 are essentially net negative environmental impact guarantees. And a tiny percentage, just under 3% of the $3.7 trillion that we've really focused on, has a net positive nature outcome. This is unacceptable. It's taxpayers' money, it's our money, and we need to expect and demand from governments that they shift these numbers to a radical level, far higher in terms of the net positive gains for nature that those stimulus programs can deliver, not only in G20 countries, but their broader global spread. And then the second piece, of course, is sovereign debt. Kristalina Georgieva, the IMF managing director, made a comment at the launch of a report last week. We have two problems, sovereign debt and nature. Surely we can combine different solutions to address both simultaneously. Financing for Nature, alongside a number of other organizations, has focused on how that can be done and has developed what we're calling nature performance bonds. So if you like, a next generation sovereign instrument, sovereign debt instrument, that can reduce the cost of coupon and principal, so reduce the cost of capital to developing countries at this time of need in exchange for nature performance upsides. We need to focus on these large numbers. Clearly, there are many things that can be done at the local level and should be, but without addressing these multi-trillion-dollar numbers that really are shaping the global economy as we hopefully emerge from the pandemic, we will emerge with a net loss in the biodiversity space as opposed to what is completely possible if we address both of these financial flows, which is a net positive outcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. And maybe what I can do now is build on your very powerful remarks also around the fact that we only have 3% net positive nature outcome from the recovery plans, which is quite catastrophic. I'd like to ask the panel a question, and this comes back to Minister of Grenada, who very clearly indicated, are we at a global tipping point or are we at a turning point? If you are going to say that you have one key example where you feel that you're seeing a turning point, what would it be? And how would you bring it to scale and replicate it within the finance and investment realm? So I'll turn to you first, Minister Mesa.
Thank you. And it's hard to say that we are in a turning point, but I like to be positive and think that we can really do and give deliver the right policies and give the right signals for starting in this turning point. But I will say that one concrete example for these, and I would take this element of the importance of managing debt, and I will say that this idea, for example, really bringing swap for nature debts and these kind of instruments can be a very good signal and point that can allow us in the different countries to really implement concrete projects that can protect nature and the terrestrial part, but also in the ocean. And I will say that these kind of instruments and this kind of collaboration can be very positive right now at the global scale. And I will say that we really need to see this kind of signals and this kind of instruments implemented to really catalyze this transformation and to really starting in this turning point.
Thank you, Minister. Could I maybe ask you a follow-up question to that? Because we saw that there was the opportunity for giving further funding to the leader of Brazil, Bolsonaro, and yet he turned it down. And I think that was a bit of a political misstep, in particular from the French government. Do you feel that there's an appetite within the Latin American region, and in particular when we look at the Amazon and the preservation of the Amazon, where we could think about debt for nature swaps or nature performance bonds as a way to really stop deforestation?
I will say that there is appetite in the region for this, for sure. And I will say that there is also good initiative, from example, the Leticia initiative that it is right now it has been leading by the government of Colombia and the other governments around with some specific projects and ideas on how to really protect this area of the Amazon. But I will say that besides the Amazon, we have these other tropical forests and other very pristine and unique ecosystems. And I will also bring again the idea of not only talk about the forest, but also talk about the ocean and the protection of the ocean as well, which is also too critical. But the message is, yes, I think there is appetite. Of course, as in every continent and in every region, you will have different voices. But I will say that there is a lot of voices in countries that are really wanted to see these financial flows. And as I was saying, if we give clear signals, we will have better responses from the different governments.
Thank you. And the call for both the green and the blue together is absolutely fundamental. Minister Steele, what would be your response to my question coming from your perspective?
I think the conversation has matured in recent times. So I think there is a realistic understanding of the challenges that face certainly within the developing world. The conversation has honed in on some critical issues, such as our inability to finance some of the actions that we desperately need to take. And again, just rolling back to the discussion last week with the GCF and looking at some of the innovative instruments that they are developing or looking to develop, speaking to sovereign guarantees, debt for nature, debt for climate swaps, looking at new asset classifications to try and build the business case for nature-based interventions, adaptation, mitigation interventions. So the conversation has become very real in recent times. And you're seeing ambition from a number of us, again, in recognition of what we need to do. I think the thing now is to convert these conversations into real action. We know what needs to be done. We know many of the solutions that need to be applied. It's now the doing and converting talk into action.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. And I think so many of us who are working on really trying to implement some of these declarations, in particular emergency declarations, we now have 1,730 countries across the globe, but we don't have comparable actions that are put in place, except for in some local areas. And this is why it's so important to really bring in also local authorities who seem to be more equipped at this time and ready to actually show leadership. Also in Central and Eastern Europe and in other regions where at the federal level there isn't as much leadership. I don't know if you agree with that from your perspective in Albania, actually, Deputy Mayor.
Absolutely. I mean, if we're talking about cities, we're talking about 85% of the population by 2050. And this is really the people you need to work with. It would be easy if, I would be sitting here right now and I would be saying, well, there's not enough financing to move into green recovery or green projects. Well, the national government hasn't adapted this and that and that. But listen, there's a lot of things that we could do without extra financing. First thing is stopping financing that is hurting the city instead of encouraging it. After the earthquake, our commitment was every public building that is going to be built in the city with public funding is going to have a zero carbon footprint. And that's just something that we didn't need extra money for. That is money that we were going to spend anyways, but we do it in the right way. So in the local level, I think there is a lot of momentum and there is a lot of need to do things just in a better way without waiting for major political decisions or major budget lines or major financing. Wherever we can, we will invest the money in the right way.
Okay, thank you for that. And Simon, for you, I mean, clearly we're all talking about stranded assets. We know we have to shift out of stranded assets. We're actually seeing that now there is more MDBs who are shifting out, like the EIB actually indicated very clearly it's pulling out of all investments in fossil energy. And yet, exactly as Minister Steele indicated, we're still not acting enough. We have many declarations and possibilities, but we don't see the great replication and scale that we need now, in particular post-COVID. Before you say what you're going to say, just one last thought, which is, as I indicated in my opening remarks, what we are seeing is that it is those countries who are shifting away from stranded assets, those cities that have looked at their value chains and the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as those companies that have done the same, that seem to be coming out of COVID much more resilient. And we still don't have all the data, but it is starting to demonstrate that that's the case. But how do we scale this up? Simon.
Sandrine, clearly there are many things that need to be done, but it turns out that there are a very small number of people that can move the large numbers. If I focus on the issue of the G20 stimulus, which has a global footprint, and the terms on which nature can be integrated into sovereign debt restructuring, there are probably a dozen named individuals out of 7.5 billion people that can really make that happen. Yeah, and they come together through the G20 at the IMF annual meetings. They are the leaders of finance in sovereign states that are important in the world today. And so I would leave us, if you like, with a reminder that it's not institutions that make change. It's individuals that really forge a difference. And a tiny number of people can change the footprint of this global stimulus program that we see avalanching across the world today. And a tiny number of people through the G20 and elsewhere can bring nature into the core of sovereign debt restructuring over the coming period.
Thank you. So coming back to individuals, I'd like to thank you all for joining this panel. Really, it's been very animated, and I very much appreciate all of your individual work in your countries, and really wish you a great deal of luck. And Simon, on your crusade to bring in debt for nature swaps and also a shift within sovereign bond structure. Thank you very much for joining me. I'd like to now close the entire session and thank you all who have been watching with first a few closing remarks from myself and then a closing video. We're going to try to show that video from Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the UN. What's been said very clearly is that the majority of citizens actually do not want to go back to business as usual, as long as we protect their lives and livelihoods. And yet what we've learned today is that most of our stimulus programs are not necessarily building back better, but actually going back to business as usual. The main message coming out of COVID-19 to the world is that there's no more business as usual possibility. We cannot have bailouts in high carbon sectors for companies that are systematically destroying nature and biodiversity. The leaders' pledge today said we need to put nature at the core. And the green recovery and green stimulus programs that are being proposed by those countries that you've heard from today, including the European Union and others, are very much putting nature at the core and decarbonization at the core. For them, transformational change is what we are in now. It's the only way that we're going to get out of this pandemic and prepare for future crises. We, through the Planetary Emergency Partnership and the Club of Rome, have really been gathering organizations together to come behind the fact that we need this transformational change, and together we actually can do this. I think it's incredibly important that we bring these messages to people. We heard from Oliver and others that we need to put people at the core as long as we put nature at the core. So for us, people, planet, and prosperity has to be part of our pathway forward. It has to address the underbelly of the economic system shift that we need to move away from wealth to well-being. It has to look at the financial ramifications, changing the financial system, but also financing change, upping the scale in terms of private investments, public investment, to really draw out the stranded assets and bring in the new assets that are going to create the real resilience in our societies. So thank you for being there to support us. I wish we could have had a proper conversation. And I wish you, as individuals, much courage to do what you're doing in your daily lives, to transform, because this is the moment to work together to create the economies and the recovery that we need post-COVID. I'm now going to turn it to Ban Ki-moon, and I hopefully hope that actually the video will work this time, and I wish you a good evening from Brussels and a good day for all of you who are not here in the European Union. Thank you very much. It looks like our video is not working, so I think we're going to call it a night and just have the closure video, which the team will put on. Again, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Such an important and timely topic. We thank our speakers for their words and perspectives. After a short break, we will resume with our last session of the day, discussing a specific approach to important policy decision-making. Join us back, and if you are not there yet, remember to visit us at the official UNDP Twitter account at UNDP Live or at natureforlifehub.org. Don't go far. We'll see you soon.